is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and you're listening to Homebrewed Christianity, where since 2008 we've been bringing you podcasts to blow your mind piece right through your earbuds. What do you think about that, Elgin?
Cool.
Elgin and I, we're on vacation, and I'm recording this intro, and he wants to go watch a movie. What movie do you want to go watch?
Jaws.
Okay, so like Jaws is an amazing movie, and it brings together suspense, thriller, a giant shark. It's a vacation film. But like, if you were to say what is the equivalent of that in a philosopher of religion,
I have no idea.
it would be Fiona Ellis, who's on the podcast today. Fiona Ellis is on the podcast. She's a philosopher of religion, and she's part of the God and the Book of Nature grant.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, and Dad was going to say sometime, thank you for 1,000 subscribers for his YouTube channel.
Oh, Elgin is very invested in YouTube, and I hardly ever use YouTube, except 1,000 people subscribe, so now he's like convinced I should use it more. But nonetheless, anyway, Fiona Ellis is a philosopher of religion, and she spends a lot of time looking at the concept of naturalism, and what it means methodologically, scientifically, and how you understand God-world relationship. We'll talk about that, and desire. And we have a lot of fun talking about it. So I hope you enjoy this episode. Before we jump in, I want to tell everyone, if they go to jamescohnwasright.com, that's right, jamescohnwasright.com, you can join the Homebrewed reading group on Black Theology that's running through August and September. Go to jamescohnwasright.com. And for the next 2 months, we're going to get to read a whole host of different texts in Black theology, focusing obviously on James Cone. And not only is Adam Clark, who had James Cone as his mentor at Union Theological Seminary for his PhD, joining, but Monica Coleman is going to join, womanist process theologian, and the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, Michael Curry, is joining for a session. So it's going to be too much fun. It is a pay what you can. So you can either, donate $1 million, right? Or zero, or anywhere in between, because we really want to get as many people as possible reading and reflecting on these amazing texts in theology. I hope you enjoy this episode. We're going to go watch Jaws. Elgin, do you have any closing thoughts on joining a Homebrewed Christianity intro?
No, I just walked in and Dad told me to be in the intro.
See? All right. So, enjoy. Hello, everybody. This is Trip, and I'm here with Fiona Ellis, who is a philosopher, scholar and part of the God and Nature grant that I'm a part of. And you're in London right now, right?
That's right, yeah. And I work at the University of Roehampton, which is where I've been for the last couple of years.
And that's where Keith Ward is as well?
Mm-hmm. Keith Ward and John Cottingham, and they're professorial fellows in the Centre for Philosophy of Religion that I direct. And we've worked together for about the past 12 years since we were at Heythrop College, which closed a couple of years ago. So it's been fantastic working with them. We've done some really interesting stuff. Mm-hmm. Worked on some good projects.
Yeah, Keith has been on the podcast 10 times over the years.
Oh, has he?
Yeah, so everyone will be familiar with him. They're regular listeners. So then they can just imagine what happens when you two are not being recorded and decide to get into it. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself and how your own faith story and intellectual journey led to becoming a scholar and philosopher in religion.
So I did a straight philosophy degree in London at Wadham College, and I was taught by two really important intellectual figures for me, Roger Scruton and David Wiggins. And it was wonderful to be taught by such big picture types who were convinced that the really big questions were fundamental to philosophy. And for Roger, at least, it was really important that the God question was right up there at the top as well. So from the beginning, I had a real sense that philosophy was concerned with these really big perennial questions concerning life, meaning, etc. I think I really accept with Iris Murdoch that the problems of philosophy are the problems of my life. And I think that was the kind of conception that I also got from, well, somebody like Roger, who was very good friends with Murdoch as well. So I did my BA, and then I went to Oxford and did the BPhil, which is the graduate course in philosophy. And David Wiggins was my supervisor. He'd since moved to Oxford. And I was taught also by Paul Snowdon. And I did a thesis on metaphysics and metaphor, and looked in particular at the mind-world relation, and considered figures like Nietzsche, Hegel, Kant, and then people like John McDowell and Wiggins, who've been really important figures in my intellectual development. So having done all of that, I moved on to do the DPhil, stayed with Paul and David, and eventually got it, and hung around Oxford for a while and had lectureships at Queen's College and Wadham, and eventually got a job at Heythrop College, which was the Jesuit college within the University of London. And that was a real game changer for me, because up until this point, I hadn't really conversed with theologians. I didn't really know many theologians. And I'd never done a philosophy of religion class, because Roger thought that I should be focusing more upon things like, I don't know, Thomas Mann and Faust and questions of meaning, things that wouldn't appear in that kind of syllabus. And also things like Rilke's poetry, and just a lot of really fantastic stuff, and music as well. So I came to Heythrop College and was suddenly in a place where there are a lot of theologians who are really anxious to talk about the things that I was really interested in. And just an interesting aside here, when I got the job at Heythrop College, one of my friends, Galen Strawson, said, "Oh, that's really good. Theologians are much more open-minded than philosophers. You'll have a really great time there." And I thought that was a really telling and interesting comment. And he was absolutely right about that, because the theologians that I met were really interested in figures like Levinas. I hadn't read Levinas before, and the principal of the college at the time was a theologian called John McDade, who had a room full of books by Levinas, and he allowed me to steal them or just borrow them indefinitely. And we would have lots of conversations about this really interesting thinker. And gradually I came to see that all of the issues that I'd been really interested in from the moment of being an undergraduate in philosophy, and I guess before that as well, questions pertaining to the mind-world relation, idealism, realism, what are we to think about God, or is this relation between God and value? How does meaning factor into all of this? Questions that I'd approached via a lot of analytic philosophers, but also continental philosophers like Heidegger and Hegel and Jean-Paul Sartre. I realized that these were exactly the questions that the theologians were engaged with. And it was just so interesting to get that very different take upon the issues, and in a way to rediscover my Catholic upbringing that I'd rejected in the way that many people do about the age of 13, on the ground that it was pretty irrelevant to the things that seemed to be important to me at the time. And that was it. So everything came full circle, really. I connected the philosophy with the theology, continued working with figures like David and Roger, read a lot of McDowell and more McDowell, and I suppose deepened my understanding of Hegel in that way as well, who's always been a really interesting figure to me. And eventually, moving in this direction, I developed the kind of naturalism that I developed in God, Value and Nature, expansive naturalism. And all of these different figures and these different approaches fed into that kind of position.
When you start to develop your notion of expansive naturalism, could you describe the naturalism as maybe the average person thinks of it and the genealogy of it, right? Because one of the things you do in the book, I think really well, is you kind of show the way in which the activity of science comes then to interpret a world and then hand it back to us as if this is all that's bounded in it.
So, I mean, one of the things that I make clear in the book is that most analytic philosophers would describe themselves as naturalists. And the implication is that if you're not a naturalist, then there's something intellectually pretty problematic about you. And naturalism, in this sense, is intended to be anti-religious, atheistic, and stands opposed to anything remotely otherworldly and spooky, which is the word that's often used, always pejoratively, in this context. So all of those philosophers, and there are many, who describe themselves as naturalists on the ground that this is the only really intellectually defensible position, when they're pushed over the question of what they're really committed to, will first of all claim at the negative level that they're anti-supernaturalism, where that's supposed to be a placeholder for a position that involves reference to spooky entities like God, immortal souls, angels, or whatever, strange spirits that we cannot begin to comprehend. So they're anti-supernaturalist. And if you say, well, what does your position really amount to at a more positive level, they will claim that, and I'm not sure how many naturalists will now say this, but when I was writing the book in 2014, I would say that most naturalists would take this kind of line. And the line that they take is to say that the limits of reality and explanation are to be determined exclusively by science or the sciences. And of course, science and the sciences mean lots of different things, but it's a kind of move which rules out the possibility of there being any kind of understanding of reality, a legitimate understanding of reality, which is not scientifically grounded. So they commit to a kind of scientific naturalism in that respect. Now, is that clear?
Yeah. How would you contrast the kind of the way naturalism functions methodologically for the investigation of science with how it's appropriated, or how scientific knowledge is appropriated for ontology?
So one way of summing up the position is to say that the scientist has the measure of reality. And that leads to the question of whether the restriction here is to be understood in methodological or ontological terms. And I guess it's a bit of both. You might want, and there are different ways of drawing the relevant limits. You might want to say that there's no more to reality than what can be comprehended at the level of physics, for example. And that's a very restrictive form of materialism. And I think it's quite problematic to make that kind of position work and justify it. You know, there are no good philosophical or scientific reasons for insisting upon that kind of restriction. But you might then go, supposing you take this restriction seriously, you might then say that this methodological approach is going to have implications for ontology, because there are things within reality or dimensions of reality which cannot be comprehended using only the resources of the physicist. And that would lead you to ask the question of whether, if you're anti-naturalist in either of these senses, there's a more relaxed approach which would allow you to say that there's more to reality than what can be comprehended in these terms. like, for example, moral reality.
What kind of assumptions do you interact with in the academy and then maybe in the public square where you see this kind of flattened or reductive naturalism as normative?
And I think one important point here, just going back to biography, is that I was taught by somebody, Wiggins, who was really opposed to scientific naturalism. So all of my lectures on ethics, I had this anti-scientistic approach rammed into me, and I took it really seriously. Just the idea that there is more to reality than what can be comprehended by science. And the relevant dimension at issue here was the dimension to which we're receptive at the level of our natural moral being. So from the point of view of my intellectual development and biographical history, there was never a stage at which I was surrounded by teachers who were preaching the truth of scientific naturalism. On the contrary, I was open to figures like Wiggins and Scruton and others who were very much opposed to this restrictive conception of reality. But it seemed to be all around me from the point of view of what I was reading at the time.
Well, do you think part of this conversation, especially when you're engaging cross disciplines, is if you studied philosophy and know the history of philosophy, and then you read the philosophers that think in a kind of reductive scientism, you just think, y'all got rid of all the interesting parts. That's been, you think there's so many beautiful questions that get at what it means to be human when you read something like you read The Republic with a group of 20-year-olds. And if what you're getting at when you're wrestling with a text like that gets reduced to something that there's some type of promissory note that eventually physics will explain everything that was going on there, it just seems problematic. But philosophers tend to be ones that the long history of an idea is almost as interesting as the question of the present. And science tends to absolutize the present understandings and then problematize them, seek it out, disprove it, and such. But the history of science isn't something science as a truth regime pays lots of attention to.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a really difficult question here concerning who the scientific naturalists really are. And I must admit that when I was writing the book, I struggled with this. And I think one of the things that can happen when people make judgments about philosophical positions, and I know this happens all of the time with idealism and Berkeley and Spinoza, is that they get this kind of potted version, textbook version of what they think these people are saying, and then it's passed on because the relevant position's summarized in 5 pages for the sake of a student. And you get a really flawed picture of what is being said. Think about Berkeley's idealism. It's summarized in such a way that, the idea is that Berkeley thought that you couldn't actually do this, but of course it's nothing to do with that.
Fiona was kicking something, for those that wanted to know what that thud was.
And, Berkeley thought that the only way of defending a sober form of realism was to be an idealist in his sense. So the idea that idealism and realism are opposed is nonsense. But I mean, just going back to the issue of scientific naturalism. So I wasn't quite clear about what scientific naturalism was. And one of the themes of the book is that the boundaries at issue here, like between natural and supernatural or natural and non-natural, science versus non-science, are really porous and open to question. And I wouldn't want to come across as somebody who has been quite narrow about all of this and dogmatic, so that it's just obvious that scientific naturalism is wrong and their insights are in bad order. And one of the illustrations of this dialectic and this problem in the book was the debate between Peter Railton, who puts forward what he describes as a form of moral realism, which is a form of scientific naturalism. But it's way beyond any kind of simplistic, dogmatic form of scientific naturalism that cannot really make sense of the idea that there is an independent source of value, etc. And there's a knife edge between his position and Wiggins' position. And there are a few papers where they discuss their respective positions and get a bit perplexed about where the differences really come out. But I just thought that that was a very telling interaction. Obviously, Roehampton's not working at the level of physics. He's working at the level of social science. And his scientific naturalism is defined in those much broader terms. But it was really difficult to figure out what the difference was between their positions. And, you know, this is significant when you come to think about another really important figure in this debate, Hume, and where he stands. Wiggins subscribes to Hume's form of naturalism in one important sense, but he thinks that Hume can go a stage further and be a cognitivist and allow that there are facts about morality, moral values. I mean, he grants that Hume didn't quite go as far as that, but I don't know, I guess he thinks that the potential's there in Hume, and I think he's right. So Wiggins thinks that there's a knife edge between Hume and Kant. I think there's a bit of a knife edge between Roehampton's scientific naturalism and Wiggins's expansive naturalism or non-naturalistic picture. The terms, again, get bandied around and the distinctions are very porous. So who is a scientific naturalist? I'm not that clear. It's certainly not the typical scientist, I think, because if you go back over the history of science, a lot of scientists are quite happy to grant that there is a religious dimension of reality that cannot be wholly comprehended in scientific terms. So that's really important. And it's a theme that comes up repeatedly, as you know, in the history of science.
I wonder if there's kind of two different dimensions that you get at where or how scientific naturalism functions. One is just rhetorically in the public square, scientific naturalism and are you a real naturalist gets used in this real tight-fisted deflationary necessity you put on any type of confessional tradition or religious tradition or spiritual intuitions and such. And then there's the way naturalism functions when you're in the business of seeking truth within the academy, like a philosopher or something. And you give examples where you just go like the ideological agenda of naturalism, which kind of performs this type of materialist prejudice in the public square, doesn't cohere with the way naturalists engage thinking about questions like value or aesthetics, these types of questions. And the thing I love about the concept of expansive naturalism is while you are delineating it and expanding it out, you're also saying a lot of people are already doing this, so let's be honest so that our prejudice doesn't inhibit us from seeking truth in the most robust way.
And I guess the really interesting thing, and I think you're right, that there is this distinction between what can happen out there in the public square and what happens when you're doing serious philosophy and finding that you can't reduce things to sound bites, etc. So I think you're right about that. But there is this other worry that the prejudices somehow come out again in the academy once religion comes into the picture. Because it's as if, you know, even those liberal or expansive naturalists who are happy to allow that there's more to reality than what can be comprehended scientifically, most of them will stop short of moving in the direction of God on the ground that that would be to reintroduce all of the spooky supernatural items that the naturalist is supposedly getting away from. And I think there are prejudices at work here, and a lot of it's because of theological ignorance. And I think a lot of philosophers who argue in this way are operating with a conception of God that we need to reject. You know, this idea of God being some kind of spooky entity up there, standing opposed to the natural world. I mean, that kind of supernaturalistic framework that I want to get away from, and that philosophers like Wiggins and McDowell are wanting to get away from for the case of moral value. So I think I'm wanting to say, what you've done for value, bring it back down to earth, you can do for God as well, and it's not so different from the position that you've ended up with. So perhaps you're always already there, going back to what you said earlier.
Mm-hmm. Thinking as with expansive naturalism in your mind, how does that change the way you understand something like the divine immanence and divine transcendence?
So, there is a complication in this story that has been really important to me in the last year, really, when I discovered that the kind of expansive naturalism that I'm defending in that book, after people like McDowell and Wiggins and just moving that in a theistic direction, there's one really important figure that I missed out in this history, and that's Iris Murdoch. And Murdoch was already in 1956 defending what she called true naturalism. And she said in this 1956 paper on vision and choice, it was a paper for the Aristotelian Society, she says that the true naturalist believes we are immersed in a reality that transcends us, and moral progress consists in awareness of this reality and submission to its purposes. Now that, for her, is a kind of Platonism, and she takes reality to be grounded in what she describes as a magnetic and inexhaustible centre. This is goodness for her. And she takes herself to be defending a form of religion that takes us beyond the limitations of theism. And that move is hugely significant for what I've been wanting to do. And you can see that people like McDowell and Wiggins and Mark Platts, they're all in Oxford at the same time. And her shadow was somehow cast over all of their work. McDowell does occasionally make reference to her, but for the most part, she's conspicuous by her absence. And I find that really weird. So that's one thing, that the case of Murdoch is dead important to all of this. And it's important because she somehow is a way of moving from somebody like McDowell, who takes himself to be putting forward a form of atheism. I actually, that's probably unfair to him. He stops short of wanting to talk about any kind of religious dimension to reality on the ground it's simply beyond our ken to describe reality in those terms. I think the interesting thing about Murdoch is that she makes clear that we can use that kind of terminology. We can talk about religion, we can talk about transcendence, even at the level of moral reality. And that's the kind of link that I want to make sense of and move in the direction of theism. So just back to your question then, how do I see the relation between transcendence and immanence? One, going back to the Murdoch stuff, I think there's a real question about how we're to understand the nature of the transcendent. And that's really the question of what the relation is between goodness and God. And it's a difficult question, and we can go on talking about it forever. But I think it's not obvious that we're remotely clear about what it means to talk about God in personal terms. And once you make that concession, there perhaps is not too much of a massive difference between the kind of Platonism that Murdoch wants and the kind of theism that I want. So it's not clear how we're to understand the nature of the transcendent. As for your question about its relation to the immanent, I think I would take a pretty Hegelian line here and say that we need to get away from that kind of dualistic framework according to which we have the immanent on one side, which is nature, and the transcendent on the other side, which is supernature, and no way of going from one to the other. It's that kind of picture that gives rise to atheism and makes it seem pretty much mandatory, given the difficulties of supernaturalism and given well, all of the worries about spooky reality, etc. So at the least, you have to break down that dualism and allow that the transcendent is somehow accessible to us at the level of the immanent. I think I would describe that as a radical form of immanentism, in the sense that it breaks the dualism of the immanent and the transcendent. Now, look, this is all sounding really abstract, and I've got a quotation that I'm just going to look at. It's a quotation from Paul Tillich, who says, "To call God transcendent in this sense does not mean that one must establish a superworld of divine objects. It does mean that within itself, the finite world points beyond itself. In other words, it is self-transcendent." And I just want to give you another quote from John Robinson's 1963 book, Honest to God. He's just quoted Tillich saying that. And he says, "This, I believe, is Tillich's great contribution to theology, the reinterpretation of transcendence in a way which preserves its reality while detaching it from the projection of supernaturalism. The divine, as he sees it, does not inhabit a transcendent world above nature. It is to be found in the ecstatic character of this world as its transcendent depth and ground." So that's Tillich's ecstatic naturalism. And it grants us the right to remodel our understanding of transcendence so that it's not a matter of postulating some distant entity in the sky, which bears no relevance to the natural world and our natural human being. It's a matter of expanding the limits of nature and our natural human being so as to allow that it has these, going back to Murdoch, inexhaustible and infinite depths.
I really appreciate that. And I wonder, that element in Tillich is one of those times it's very clear the role Schelling played in his formation. And you explored that the way German idealism uses the relationship of infinite and finite.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really important distinction. Once you understand how German idealists, and Hegel is the character you're using in the text to talk about it, it really reframes what is the potential of the finite world.
Yes, and just the way in which on Hegel's picture, the finite world and finite things stand in this really complex dialectical relation to the infinite. So that's really, really important. I mean, I guess the other important thing, we've said a lot about structure, but another important thing that comes from Murdoch again, which we also get in people like Levinas, is just the central place of love in all of this. And that has led me to go beyond some of the things that I said in the book and try to spell out some of the implications for how we could think about God's reality, moving away from this supernatural being and thinking about God's reality in more relational, love-involving terms, and how that feeds into what somebody like Murdoch wants to say along the lines of her Platonism, that our mode of access to this divine reality is loving desire.
Mm-hmm. So would you say Hegel's rejection of dualism is connected to an inclusive account of the infinite, right? As opposed to the infinite set over against the finite. The infinite is inclusive of the finite. And you make a connection between some of what Hegel's doing there and Spinoza, if you don't let the short version of Spinoza in most philosophy books determine it. And he's become popular again, right? Especially in continental circles who are doing all sorts of readings of Spinoza. So can you talk about Spinoza's pantheism as a trope and then kind of... So brilliant. And I love Spinoza. And a couple of years ago at Heythrop, when I was doing a project with Mario De Caro on supernaturalism and naturalism, one of our project team was a really great guy from Bamberg University called Marco Fuchs.
And he was interested in developing expansive naturalism in relation to Spinoza, and he's a perfect figure for it, really. So Spinoza is a naturalist, and he's an expansive naturalist, and he's a theist. It was funny, I was in a discussion yesterday where there were quite a few humanists who were atheists talking about Spinoza and found it quite difficult to describe him in theistic terms. But, he is a theist in the way that Hegel's a theist, and he can allow for a distinction between God and the world, and he makes clear what that distinction is, and he can allow that God created the world, etc., etc. So, he's an important figure, and he's an important figure as far as love is concerned too, because he talks about the intellectual love of God. And when he talks about the intellectual love of God, it's a mistake to suppose that he's somehow taken the feeling out of love and is reducing everything to a cold kind of rationalism. He's gone beyond that dualism of reason and desire, the kind of dualism that you commit to if you cannot make sense of the idea that there is value to be found in the world and that we're capable of responding to it at the level of loving desire, etc. So Spinoza, really important figure, important to people like John Robinson, Tillich,
And I think it's important for people to recognize a lot of what some of the new questions, right? Like where you see these certain dead ends in contemporary kind of intellectual life. There are philosophers who have resources for framing the questions differently. So you get more generative versions of the questions. And I think people like Spinoza and such do that. When I was in California and I was part of a research discussion group, and a minority of us were religious in any sense. And it became assumptions that we just don't have good intellectual ways of talking about the origin of reality, where life ultimately emerges from in an explanation of life, value, aesthetics, these types of things, right? And consciousness. And I just found like those four issues, if you're doing philosophy, then your explanation should cohere with science as you understand it and not make the origin of all finite reality, the emergence of life, consciousness, and value just mysteries, right? Like that as a theologian, it's problematic when you ask a good theological question and someone goes, but mystery trip, right? Yeah. And so I wonder how one of the things when I found your book, it was, I don't really feel the need to reject naturalism. I just feel like nature should at least include our own encounter with the world. And as a radical empiricist, that would include my own experiencing self. And I don't think we should start eliminating positions because they might start to help us think and talk about questions we all know are real.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why the work that you're doing for the Book of Nature project is so important as well. You know, bringing in science, theology, getting some important and interesting dialogue between practitioners in those fields, and granting in the way that everybody has to grant that science is dead important to all of this. So just trying to get clear about how the different levels of explanation interact is so important. It's so difficult too, isn't it?
Yeah, I've done a number of conversations with people running research projects around integrated information theory, and I don't know how many of them are going to be allowed to be public, but after I talk to them long enough, right, so they understand what they're doing, and then they're asking the philosophical questions and things. I always eventually get around to asking the people running research projects about what motivates them to do it. And then you almost always hear a narrative that would be horribly understood if you had a reductive framework for countering it. I was talking with a rather famous integrated information researcher, and he talks about having this intense religious experience in nature, where his own mortality came before him, and then the beauty of nature and awe that struck him, and he just knew his kind of reductive assumptions didn't work, and that's where that drive led to this, research project he's on, and I said, so what about that? And he goes, well, there's just so much of what it means to be human I wasn't giving myself permission to acknowledge. And I think that for me is one of the reasons scholars that come from faith traditions that want to affirm the dignity of humanity need to engage in these conversations to give everyone permission to acknowledge the dignity of humanity and the depths of existence. And that's unrelated, by me becoming an apologist and convincing you of some theological thing. I see those as separate tasks. And I wonder, in your position as a philosopher who engages with the sciences and with religious traditions, how you understand that task of expanding the depth dimension that Tillich's talking about, or expanding naturalism to include more of those things that make us most human.
I mean, I think that one important metaphilosophical issue here is what we take ourselves to be doing, or what we ought to be doing when we're doing philosophy. And I guess this is a Hegelian influence and an influence from Wiggins and all of those people. But we've just got to get away from the idea that we're in the game of knockdown arguments and we're trying to prove who's the cleverest of all and trying to make our points stick, etc. And we've got to take a much more humble approach, which is a matter of moving away from the ego. So, if you shoot a question at me that I can't answer, it doesn't matter. It just means that this is a really difficult thing and we're trying to explore something together. And that's certainly the approach that I take with my students and with philosophy more generally. So what I'm trying to do here is not prove that you've got to take seriously the God question and got to allow that God exists. I'm just trying to get you to a position where you agree with the different steps that I've taken. Like, there aren't really any good reasons for restricting reality in this way, are there? No, like scientifically. So once we agree on that, we can perhaps go a bit further, can't we? Yes. And we think that reality is dead important. Back to that Murdoch quote. She doesn't say, I know we are immersed in a reality which transcends us. She says, I believe, or the true naturalist believes, and she italicizes believe. We believe we are immersed in a reality that transcends us, etc. And this accords with our experience at an intuitive level, doesn't it? And the arguments against this kind of position are not knocked down, and we can keep continuing and exploring along these lines. And then we can start talking about God. And a lot of us were brought up to think that this is absurd and spooky, and if you're a real philosopher, you can't go there, etc. And we worry that those approaches are themselves questionable, and we take on board Heidegger's idea that questioning things is really, really important rather than shooting ahead looking for answers. And moving along in that direction, we suddenly arrive at a really quite surprising position, and it's different from where we thought we were. And hey, this is really interesting, and perhaps fills us with wonder, and maybe we could even get ourselves into a position where we could take God seriously. So it's that kind of approach, not this is where you've got to go, this is where reason's taking you, and if you don't draw this conclusion, then there's a flaw in your reasoning, etc. It's much more open-ended, and just let's see how far we can get. And isn't this interesting and surprising? And I think that that's a bit like Hegel's approach, really. We can agree upon all sorts of things about our experience. What are the presuppositions in all of this? That's, I suppose, making it sound a bit rather different from what I've just said and putting a different dimension or spin on it. But it's that kind of idea. So that's where I am as a philosopher. And I think that point that I made at the beginning about ego is really important, and it's really important to Murdoch, because, she thinks that the real problem with human beings, and, it's not an original take on it, is that we have this kind of original sin, which is that we're somehow too obsessed with ourselves in an egoistic sense. We need to get away from that.
Mm-hmm. How do you understand the relationship in the book? You turn towards like engaging more directly theological things towards the end. How do you understand the relationship between science, philosophy, and then theological accounts within particular traditions? Because you use the concept of myth to help negotiate that.
So I don't know. I think that, again, the boundaries at issue here are really unclear, need to be deconstructed a bit. Philosophy can mean quite a few different things, as can science. I illustrated that earlier with the dialogue between Railton and Wiggins. Theology can mean natural theology, and there's a model and paradigm in terms of which to comprehend what's going on there, where it's a matter of somehow beginning with the natural world, constructing proofs for the existence of God, where that somehow takes you beyond nature. I want to try to reconfigure natural theology in line with expansive naturalism, allowing that the resources that are available to us at this level are much richer than they would be if we stuck to the traditional paradigm, where I think the naturalistic paradigm there would be scientific naturalism, and that dictates and limits the sorts of arguments that you can come up with here. Whereas I think, and this is me in a more ambitious mode, I think I want to say that there is a form of natural theological argument which has convinced me of the existence of God at one level, but in that kind of open-ended way, really. But it's an argument which already makes use of ingredients that have taken us beyond the boundary that is supposedly intact, provided that we do natural theology according to the first traditional sense, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So, how would you kind of sketch that out? Like, if someone is interested in how you do that.
So, and I'm now making myself sound more dogmatic than I am. So, here's a desire argument for God's existence. I desire, therefore God exists. So, I mean, that sounds a bit crazy, doesn't it? And obviously it would involve spelling out the nature and limits of desire. Mm. And that is one of the questions that I've been engaged with recently. And there are many varieties of desire. I'm certainly not wanting to reduce all varieties of desire to a single model, but I do take very seriously the conception of desire that you get in Levinas, for example, where he sees desire as a state of mind which, as he puts it, is more cognitive than cognition itself, and is somehow going to be that in terms of which we relate to God, that in terms of which we are receptive to God. If you are operating with that kind of conception of desire, then my little desire argument doesn't sound as crazy as it might first have appeared, where, it might sound as if it's a form of wishful thinking. I want God to exist, therefore God exists. It's completely reconfigured so that it already contains its conclusion within its premise, if you like. So it's a very different sort of argument, which is circular and problematic at one level, but perhaps not at another.
Well, so maybe you can say a bit about, like, when you think of the concept of desire, some function around lack and others around some type of surplus, creativity and such. And while it's often assumed religious concepts of desire fit in one and not the other, I mean, you've kind of talked about how that's not the case. So maybe you could introduce those two larger visions of lack and how you understand or desire, the lack in a more creative way,
Yeah,
how you see them relating.
so there's a way of thinking about desire that some people might associate with theologians, where you think about desire as lack. You describe human beings as desire-involving beings, and then you've introduced this picture according to which we are lacking, unhappy beings, somehow defined in terms of what we're not, the kind of vision that you get in Sartre as being a nothingness. Now, there's something insightful about that model because it captures the sense in which we're finite, limited beings, and we don't want to lose that picture altogether. Now, one of the things that has interested me recently, and that what I'm wanting to develop for my next book, is a theme that you get in some Nietzschean scholars, and perhaps Nietzsche himself, where what one wants to do is to reject the kind of model that I've just described, where desire is viewed in lack-involving terms. Human beings are described and understood accordingly. And we're left with this conception of human being according to which we have this huge lack at the heart of our being. We're defined in terms of a God who does not contain any such lack. And it makes for a very pessimistic, nihilistic picture, and there's just basically no hope for us. Now, I think that people like Nietzsche saw that kind of model in a lot of religion and in people like Augustine, for example, and saw rightly that in some areas that model, that anthropology is exaggerated to such an extent that there's no room for the possibility of our somehow redeeming ourselves in any sense. We're just desperate beings, and our only hope is to somehow unite with God. We can't redeem ourselves from our own resources, etc. And a certain kind of atheist will look at that picture and think that it's our downfall. You know, the thing that we need to be redeemed from is the idea that we can't redeem ourselves and we're hopeless, lacking beings. So one approach in the light of all of this, or one solution to this problem, is to reject this way of thinking about ourselves and reconfigure our understanding of desire so that instead of thinking about it as a kind of lack, think about it instead as a kind of surplus or excess, or a giving forth rather than a taking from something that's superior to you. And that model of desire is taken very seriously by Nietzsche and by scholars like Robert Pippin, who have seen it as a way of solving the problem of nihilism. I think the idea here would be that if we could make sense of there being a kind of desire which is not to be comprehended in lack-involving terms, a kind of desire which would grant us the right to be able to redeem ourselves, make sense of ourselves, and find meaning for ourselves, then we would have solved the problem of nihilism, and we would have done so without there being any need to bring God into the picture. God, on this way of thinking, being the source of the difficulty in the first place, and the kind of framework which leads us to think about ourselves in these desperate, lack-involving, unhappy terms. So there is that dialectic that I'm really interested in, and I'm interested in it because the positive move and the positive conception of desire, as you know, is very similar to a conception of desire that's pretty standard in the theological tradition and has been developed most interestingly, for example, by Levinas. So that puts a very different take, or it puts a very different light on this dialectic. And I think one has to deny that this move away from a lack-involving conception of desire is the prerogative of the atheist. And it raises the really important question about how we to understand the nature and limits of this desire, which is now part of the picture. And well, for me, it really just takes me back to the structure of the argument in God, Value and Nature, which is we've got this position and it's possible to expand this position without infringing any of the arguments or premises or worries or assumptions of the rival party. And it can take us in really surprising directions. And of course, as far as the desire issue is concerned, our atheist will say, actually, you cannot understand this desire in theistic terms, in God-involving terms. But I think that just raises the question again of how those terms are to be understood. And the interesting question that I'm exploring at the moment is the question of whether the desire, which is so important to this kind of Nietzschean, would even be possible in a properly atheistic framework. And if it's not, that has really important implications for the problem and the solution, the problem of nihilism and its solution, and really important implications metaphysically for the question of how we should think about reality and how we should think about the limits of desire in this particular context.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that is so fascinating, and I haven't read all of your work on this, so this is mostly what pops in my head. Unlike asking questions where I've read you talk about it and want the greatest hits of Fiona Ellis for the people, but that gap. When most of my interaction with people around the concept of desire have been Freudian or Lacanian, and the gap there functions in this kind of this primal wound, this negation. And if you think of how Sartre uses it, the lack of God's reality or God's absence functions in the same way in this to generate this gap that is similar to how it functions in a negative theological tradition, and I wonder if part of that gap for Levinas is the necessary space for genuine recognition for the other and the otherness of the other to move. And if that gap, you then think of it not as a gap of lack, but a generative one or a creative one, then then that very same space, the absence isn't a lack of something, but it's actually the affirmation of being or becoming, right? Because it's only in that gap that the new, the novel, the creative, the generative comes in. And I think connected to your work, the space that immediately pops to mind is that the German idealist move is this very nested one, right? So the gap between the infinite and the finite is not a distancing gap, but a nested one, the finite within the infinite.
Yes.
And the play of the infinite and the finite is precisely the gift of finitude itself, right? That you are another. And so you could kind of look at the way that the gap where the desire mediates plays at that different level of a kind of a metaphysical one, a generative one, an ethical one. But there's I could just see a line of tracing it. That's really exciting.
Well, this is great, Trip. I'm writing all of this down. This is very, very helpful for me as I'm working all of this out. Thank you. I mean, the other important distinction here is the distinction between eros and agape. There's one way of understanding all of this, or this would be a way into it, is that eros, I mean, if you think about Anders Nygren, for example, eros has a purely human origin. It is purely selfish. It is lack involving. It involves taking rather than giving. It involves something imperfect becoming more perfect. And then on the other side, you have agape, which has its source in something perfect, namely God. And then there's a question of, and it's giving rather than taking. And there's a question about how these two dimensions of love relate. And I think it's really important that we focus upon the idea that we are concerned with two dimensions here rather than two completely different kinds of love between which there can be no interaction again. So
that's really helpful. I wonder how you would think of addressing the questions around false consciousness, because I think that in the psychoanalytic tradition, the false consciousness and the way desire relates to it is a permanent stumbling block for making positive statements, right? Like, and so unlike some of the critiques that emerge in modernity, maybe like a scientific critique or a historical critique or sociological one, like when you develop those type of critiques as critiquing some type of content or proposition, once you get the concept of false consciousness, then the origin of your own thinking is suspect, and that leads to. But I think I don't know what to put it, like like Kant has a giant like mythopoetic creation narrative and everything that supports this telling of the human, and then that hermeneutic leads to the interpretation of things based on a type of psychoanalytic rendering. And I wonder if what you're hinting at is a different way of rendering creation. So you don't address false consciousness directly. It's the multi-layered analysis of desire that makes an alternative proposal. In a sense, it comes as an affirmation of life, right? Like in a way that's similar to what you were attracted to in Nietzsche.
Yeah, and as you were talking there, I was reminded of the really important work of Bernard Williams in his book Truth and Truthfulness, where he's talking about ideology and how we can ever know that we've somehow distanced ourselves from distortions and ideology in our thinking when it can be so pervasive. And that's a related theme, really, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Nietzsche is obviously a really important figure to him as well.
Yeah. How do you think, as a scholar, when you have this these collection of voices and live questions around, say, desire and things, what is the preparation work or your own kind of method of research of deciding when I've been working with these ideas long enough that I know I'm ready to write and publish? And then how do you decide, I want to play this out in a paper and get feedback? Take us behind the scenes on your kind of intellectual craft.
Well, the really great thing about philosophy and theology is that you do a lot of the work when you're not sitting at your desk, don't you? So that when I'm walking my little sausage dog, for example, or swimming in the pond or doing any of those things, a lot of the ideas connect. I do actually spend a lot of time at my desk, and I don't know how it works. With this book that I'm planning at the moment, it's called The End of Desire, Meaning, Nihilism and God. I've had a structure for the book for about a year, and I keep thinking that the only way I can do a book is to sit here for about 4 months or something and do nothing but this. But things are changing in my head all the time, and I keep doing small papers that I can usually do quite quickly, and they feed into my understanding. Or I'm teaching a course where the theme for next week is desire and eros or something like that. And all of that somehow goes back into my head and through my ears. And then here I am again, staring at the piece of paper and looking at the screen. And it's a gradual process, but I somehow know when I'm ready. And I'm not very good at embarking upon really big projects without a decent sabbatical or an amount of time where I can do it, or sometime over the summer. So in term time, it's going on inside me. And every time I do a little paper, like I'm doing one at the moment on the meaning of life and desire, and trying to clarify some of the things that will eventually get out in the book. But that's how I work, really. So I'm building up to it gradually. And I think that by the time I set down to write the first chapter, I'll have a real good sense of where I'm going. But also there can be surprises along the way too. But I do like to plan everything quite carefully in advance before I sit down.
Mm-hmm. So, what are your favorite texts to teach?
I like Schopenhauer's The World as Will and Representation. That is just such fun. Yeah, so Schopenhauer, Heidegger's Being in Time, I really like teaching that. Spinoza, who I haven't taught for a long time. Berkeley's Idealism, fantastic. As you can see, I don't always have a purely textual approach. It's usually a theme or something like that. But with the continental philosophers, I do stick to texts. I don't particularly enjoy teaching phenomenology of spirit because I just find it so difficult, and they do, the students do as well, understandably so. But at least with Schopenhauer, you know that they could take it to the beach and quite enjoy it. No, I love teaching Schopenhauer. He's great. And he's not an atheist either.
So how has your own kind of, you talked about earlier, a return to your religious upbringing through philosophy and starting to work with at a Jesuit college. How has that impacted your own practice of faith?
Well, I don't know. At this Zoom meeting yesterday, somebody said that I was an atheist. I mean, just because I said that Spinoza was a theist. So, I'm not sure. I think that I'm struggling with what it all means, really. And I can't say that I go to church every Sunday. I'm not that kind of believer, but I am a believer, I think. So I don't know.
Well, I think that's true for lots of people. I was recently working on a class on Paul Ricoeur, and he has this line where he said we're in a post-religious age of faith, and I think that division is really helpful for me, because a lot of times when people say, well, do you believe something, they really are asking, like, do you perform what religious people are supposed to do based upon cultural norms? But then if they ask, like, if you have faith, that's like such a risky endeavor. It's interesting and exciting. And he talks about how, in a previous age, if you asked someone if they believed in God, people wouldn't know there were other options. They're just like,
and I don't believe in an interventionist God. I was going to get a song in at some place. But I think I probably believe in, I think perhaps I believe in Rowan Williams as God. But that's...
You're like, well, I don't know about the interventionist one, but Archbishop of Canterbury's.
God who does miracles or anything like that. So I don't know. It's really complicated. I think there are so many insights in all of these concepts and approaches, and there's a real question of interpretation, isn't there? Always.
Yeah, and even at the existential level, I think there's a sense that there's a difference between locating yourself in a tradition to be kind of blessed and burdened by it, to think through what it means to be human, and then being like, oh, I believe these things or I don't. In my first book, I talked about being a skeptical believer or a believing skeptic, just because the way so much, at least of American religion, deals with important questions is like, these are a stack of questions different disciplines may give you, and here's answers to it so that you can hop the fence and join the other side, because truth is normally battled between the theist and an atheist over here, and they yell, and then obviously the correct one wins. And I think for most people that are at least intellectually invested, that battle like goes on between them, right? Like what used to be in some previous time a battle where good rational reflection will lead to the theist or atheist winning, now runs right through most thinkers. And you kind of have both within you. And
I think also that this is one reason why it's so good to focus upon the concept of love, because that concept, it's agreed on all sides, isn't it? Well, all sides of decent people, that love is dead important to reality and to being human. And, the question then is, okay, we've got a concept that we all believe in, and the question is how are we to understand its limits? Mm-hmm. And I think it's much better to set up the dialogue in those terms than to close it off at the beginning by saying, look, we're concerned with the question of God, and I know that you people don't take this seriously, so we won't have a debate or a dialogue.
Yeah. How do you understand the expansive naturalist position framing in the conversation around divine action, right? Because a lot of the conversation around divine action will get rid of that kind of interventionist, supernaturalistic thing. And then your concept of expansive naturalism makes space for, I guess, multiple positions, right? Is like, how do you see that changing that conversation?
Well, because I've rejected the interventionist God, I'm not going to think about divine action in those terms. Mm-hmm. And I think probably a lot of people would agree now, wouldn't they, that those terms are not acceptable. And I think then it raises the really important question about how we're to understand the distinction between God and world and God and man as far as action is mm-hmm. concerned. And I don't know, I haven't thought enough or carefully enough about this issue to be able to say in very clear terms right now how I see the solution. But I'm pretty clear about what one shouldn't be saying in this context. And I think, as you said, that there is a lot of scope within this expansive naturalist framework to say a lot of very sensible things here. But it all, I suppose, takes us back to the question of the relation between the transcendent and the immanent, and whether and how we're to make sense of the idea that God is somehow omnipresent in everything, as opposed to being somebody up there who just interferes now and again. And I guess once you grant omnipresence, it introduces a whole host of new problems, but they're different, and perhaps one can say important things about them.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. No,
I don't know. I'm sure you've got a really interesting line on this as well, given the work that you're doing at present. Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, for me, that even when you were talking about desire, and like if the gap is a generative one, if it includes one's own recognition by the horizon of transcendence and whatever that means, and it has that metaphysical nestedness, then I think it's easy to see how, if you have a type of panentheism or a God as generative source of value and love, then the God-world relationship is instantiated in each event.
Yeah. And also in each of us, because we have to be able to make sense of the idea that we can partake in this reality. Right. And if you, for example, again, focus on the concept of love, the idea would be that we partake in this reality by virtue of loving others. Mm-hmm. And it takes me back to one of my favorite quotes from Simone Weil, where she says that God has to be on the side of the subject rather than on the side of the object. And I think God can be both of those things, but it is the really important idea that we have to talk about our participating in this reality rather than our objectifying it, or perceiving it or treating it as an object to a subject, which it cannot be.
Mm-hmm. I think modernity's theological problems tend to come when they objectify God, and then all the baggage that comes with an object pops up. Because objects, think of like just the way nature's bifurcated from the emergence of science, then like what's really real is quantifiable things and not qualitative things. Mm-hmm. Then like if you're going to talk about God, well, let's put it in a syllogism or something, as opposed to let us tell a poem about it. Yeah. Right. And it's not that, and most of us experience the world, at least, where neither one of those things is a complete account of reality. But if you think of the story of religious affect, it's much better captured by talking to a poet than talking to a mathematician.
Totally.
But the same's true of the person we love the most, even though there is a scientific account of their objectivity. It's just our bodies in interpersonal relationships function as a symbol for this this giant mystery of our subjectivity, and
Totally.
and the dignity of the other is when they remain a mysterious subject, right? Like my partner and I, we will have trouble if I think she's just the idea I have in my head, and vice versa. It's by preserving the other's mystery
That's right. Yeah.
that their otherness and love remains possible. And so I think a lot of philosophical theology has desired to say we really believe in God, so let's turn God into an equation, rather than let us figure out how to tell the theopoetics better, and then people respond to it just like they do at a math class. There's like that few percent that dig it.
And it takes us back to Iris Murdoch again, because, she talks about what happens when you fall in love, and suddenly for the first time, the egoistic shell is shattered and you become aware of a different dimension of reality, so that it's no longer just me, but it might even be you instead. And that's just so important, isn't it? And this idea of reducing God or the problem of God to an equation, again, it's this idea that you want to control and possess things rather than let them be, and appreciate them for what they are in their otherness and mystery and glory.
Yeah, I definitely think that in the academy there are places where there's been a transition to primarily thinking about our religious texts and traditions as propositions, but to dispositions about and like not taking a tradition's truths as like deposits of things to be exposited, but things to be enacted. And Revelation is a performative thing, not a propositional one. And those transitions, I think, for those that resist it are resisting it because they're wanting to say their encounter with the sacred is really real. And then I think something like what you're doing, expansive naturalism and other types of kind of more attentive philosophical theologies are going like, but the really real part is not in the battle you're going to win, right? Like when you get some apologists yelling at Bill Nye the Science Guy about things, you aren't accomplishing a lot. And they don't cohere to like holding eye contact and forgiving someone, or learning to change your consumption patterns for the well-being of the whole, or to pray for your enemy so that you learn to see them differently. Those don't happen in like an objective battle. That's just those don't result in it.
Exactly right. Yeah, it's just this confrontational model again, isn't it?
And the times confrontations are helpful is when everyone knows that it's a performative game, right? Like if you think of like professional wrestling in the States, they aren't actually beating each other up to win. They're putting on a show so that the whole group gets brought in to this story. And then you have this experience, and it's fun because you're cheering against the other one, but no one's really trying to kill each other. It's putting on a show. And like sometimes scholarly debates are really informative because you're playing a game where you both know we want to figure out the truth. So being antagonistic towards each other is really helpful. But when you think like, the battle's the means by which you get to everything, it's really hard.
Yeah, I was just thinking some seminars that used to end like in that really difficult way. I won't quote what I was going to quote.
Yeah. Well, I've had a lot of fun talking with you.
Thank you. I have with you, and honestly, I've learned an awful lot about my project as well, and it was a really lovely conversation. I've really enjoyed this session, honestly, and I think you've got so many insights too. I really like your way of thinking. It's brilliant.
Oh, thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy your meeting.
Okay, see you. Bye.
Bye.